And we're back. I'm stealing Naomi's opening line from.
No, you have to do the
episode.
You have to do the whole like.
And we're back.
Wow, that was
We
so
are
offensive.
A podcast. Why will no one date these guys? Sometimes we talk about gender issues. Sometimes we talk about dating. Sometimes we talk about ourselves because we like looking in mirrors and seeing what looks back.
We're very narcissistic.
This is true. We're very narcissistic. Yeah, it's been a couple of days since we've recorded an episode, and what an episode this one's going to be. Naomi, what are we talking about today?
Well, why don't we introduce our drink?
We need to have a structure to this. You're
we
correct.
really do.
We're nearly at a year of episodes.
Yeah.
We still haven't figured
so
that out.
let's pour our drink.
And we're messing it up again. Oh, that's so much cherry juice.
Here, I'll trade you. Give me your glass.
So we are drinking
this
today.
This is 100% cherry juice from concentrate from Trader Joe's.
Exciting stuff.
Oh God,
Really
I poured
compelling.
so much for myself. Okay, cheers.
That's better than I expected. Tastes like cherries.
It
Pretty
definitely
intense.
is cherries. Yeah.
I
think it would
really good as like a jam. If you cooked it down a little.
So just cherry jam.
Yeah.
I think it would be better if I hadn't just used mouthwash. So, so Joel, today we are talking about marriage, a history, how love conquered marriage by Stephanie Coontz. So Joel, tell me what you think this initial, I want two things from you. One, I want your perception on marriage. I'll share mine as well. And two, I want to know exactly what you think this book is about.
So I was looking for more books to talk about on the podcast online.
So he picked it out.
This referenced a bit. I saw Love a History. I saw Marriage a History. I saw some books on dating patterns in like the 1920s and 40s and 60s. And I thought it would be interesting because we're a book on dating culture, but haven't really discussed like the origins of dating, the origins of pairing up, why people pair up. We've sort of like talked about it in a roundabout way, but I assume that's based a lot in our cultural stereotypes about what marriage is and not necessarily like what it historically has been. And of course, we talk from a very Western perspective about this stuff. We're not talking about like the historical role of marriage in Africa or the Middle East or Asia. And so I'm interested in knowing if this book has anything about that. I genuinely don't know. I haven't even really browsed through Naomi's outline of this episode. I am approaching this with a fresh perspective. My assumption is she's going to talk a bit about marriage being historically used for like familial alliances and economic reasons.
Okay.
I think that's going to play a big role. It is my perception that like the idea of love and caring for people didn't really happen until like the 1960s when birth control was accessible. And that was part of the reason the 60s were considered so culturally disruptive. That's kind of where my mind is.
Okay.
Why she wrote this book, that's an interesting question. I don't know what her background is. Maybe a sociologist, maybe an anthropologist. Maybe she's very Christian and wants to talk about how important the sanctity of heterosexual marriage is. I genuinely have no idea.
So I'm about to give a book report on this. Again, I'm going to mention the title, Marriage, a History, How Love Conquered Marriage by Stephanie Coontz. Going to give her all the credit. Throughout the book, she gives a long history of different cultures and how they have dealt with marriage, how they still currently deal with marriage. And I didn't want to go into a lot of detail because that's literally the book. If you want to learn more about that, read the book, because I would literally just be reading the book at that point if I was just going through all the cultures and how they've like done marriage and stuff. But I want to go over the big things. So would you like to give your like any more information before I start this?
I think marriage is kind of silly.
Okay.
I think it's often the case that a significant portion of marriages are not done because the people actually care about each other.
Okay.
And I think there's a cultural idea that strong relationships end in marriage, and I don't think that's necessarily true. And so I'm very interested in kind of the origins of this tradition and what the modern version of marriage looks like compared to the distant past.
So I'm just going to hop right into it.
Do it.
Okay.
Bugs Bunny it. Or
She
Easter Bunny
starts the book with an introduction talking about how marriage is in crisis. And everyone thinks that marriage is in crisis.
God.
So this is her perception of the situation. She thinks that marriage is in crisis because a number of cultures around the world, not everyone, but the vast majority of young people are not getting married. So why do we think that there's a crisis in the modern world for marriage? Joel, we've named a few things. Gender equality.
Everything's so fucking expensive. You can't raise a family.
Yep.
It's harder to date because you're working 2 jobs.
She kind of introduces the topic of gender equality being an issue in marriage. She also introduces love as a reason for people not getting married. You can't find love in marriage anymore. Or when you do find it's hard to find love. So she starts the book by saying each region also blames its marriage crisis on a different culprit. In Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, governments criticize women's families for demanding such high bride prices that it is important for a young man to marry, even though they are eager to do so. But in Italy, commentators are concerned about the growing number of mamani or mama's boys who choose not to marry. These are educated men in their 20s and 30s with good jobs to stay in their parents' homes while their mothers continue to cook, clean, and shop for them. More than 1/3 of single Italian men between the ages of 30 and 35 live with their parents. 2 Canadian authors,
That's the dream.
a physician and a psychiatrist, recently argued that the crisis on family life is caused by too much gender equality. In societies with high degrees of gender equality, they predict birth rates will fall until the culture eventually collapses and is replaced by a society that restricts women's options in order to encourage higher fertility. But in Japan, many women say that they're avoiding marriage and childbearing precisely because of the lack of equality between the sexes. In China, traditional biases against women could end up making it impossible for many men to ever find wives because of China's strict policy limiting family size to 1 child. Many parents abort male fetuses, with the result that there are now 117 boys born in China for every 100 girls. By 2020, China could have between 30 million and 40 million men who cannot find wives. So that's just a little snippet into some reasons around the world why people are not marrying.
Well, that's interesting because, like, obviously cultures vary and, like, those reasons could be accurate. But, yeah, it seems a couple of those are stretches. I am aware, there's problems in China for having such a large gender ratio, which makes it difficult if you're having, monogamous relationships for people to pair up. But I would say, a lot of the liberalization we've seen around the world in the past century or two, where women have opportunities that don't involve having to settle, and I do mean settle, not settle down, means that they're more likely to, consider alternative living arrangements and even living by themselves. And maybe that's not the most economically beneficial arrangement, where they may find it a bit easier if they were to pair up with a partner, but I think they'd certainly find it a lot more pleasing. And I would say that's a generalized thing that you could apply around the world to a variety of cultures. And it's not men are sissies and don't know how to do things without their mother around, which seems a little bit like a stretch to me.
So I think that we've talked a lot about marriage being in crisis in this country, and I think there's similar trends that are going on around the world.
I wouldn't say crisis.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I would say that marriage rates are on the downturn, and that's just the statistics of it is just that.
I would say it's changing, and depending on your perspective, that can be a good or bad thing. I personally think it's a good thing, but I think the reasons people are maybe choosing to pair up or not pair up are bad and indicative of larger cultural problems like economic collapse and, the decline of the middle class and everyone being worried about the future of the world with climate change and stuff like that. So I think the presumption that marriage is inherently good and we need to pursue more of it is a bad one. I do think that marriage can be beneficial for people, but that it shouldn't be forced on people, and that there should be other options culturally available to them.
So I do agree with that, and I would like to jump into love and its role in marriage, because I think that is a big part of why people are not getting married today. I think that a lot of people are not. There's many reasons for why I think this.
The communists stole love in the 1980s.
No,
they send it on a rocket ship to the sun.
There's many reasons why I think that. One reason that I think that a lot of people get married is because they don't actually know what love is. They get too excited. They have these rose-colored glasses on, and they start their relationship and think this is how it's always going to be, and then they get married and they're like, oh crap, and then they get divorced. So that's one reason. Another reason is, in my generation specifically, I don't know about your generation. I know we're so far apart.
So many years, yeah.
I completely understand the reason why a lot of young women do not want to get married. The men out in the dating world right now, specifically on dating apps, shit. Like, I'm just throwing that out there. I don't think that it is a good idea, one, to get married early for a variety of reasons. One that you mentioned is that, like, obviously everything is so expensive. And then combining that with another person and adding more people to your family if you end up having children, that's crazy. But I want to talk about love and its role in marriage. So let's hop into that, because I think that this is extremely critical to this whole book.
This is what the book's talking about.
This is what the book's talking about. So love and marriage is a Western concept. And I didn't completely understand that, because I was always completely under the impression that throughout history, there's these great love stories like Zeus and Hera. I mean, that was a terrible love story, but there was love someone involved in that. And it was mostly on Zeus's side with his penis. But
Gilgamesh and his good friend Enkidu, who were definitely more than friends, because they slept together in the same bed and would wrestle in order to hang out and have a good time.
But we definitely didn't learn about gay sex when we went to a liberal arts school.
They were just really good friends, Naomi.
They're just wrestling.
Yeah,
there's
wrestling. Nothing about the sex that got introduced into that story. No, I agree with you. There are lots of stories we interpret as love and affectionate over time. I don't know if when you read the stories, the takeaway is actually that the two people love each other.
Yeah.
I think when people describe love, they talk about like Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
And they're like how romantic it was, and you read it and you're like, these are two horny 14-year-olds
who
do really bad decisions.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use them as a role model for love and a caring relationship. But yeah, I do think that's something that has been prized over time.
So she kind of gives like a short excerpt. I mean, it's the whole book talking about it, but I'm just going to give a short excerpt on love and its role in marriage throughout history. So couples were not to put their feelings for each other above more important commitments, such as their ties to parents, siblings, cousins, neighbors, or God. In ancient India, falling in love before marriage was seen as a disruptive, almost antisocial act. The Greeks thought love sickness was a type of insanity, a view that was adopted by medieval commentators in Europe. In the Middle Ages, the French defined love as a derangement of the mind that could be cured by sexual intercourse, either with a loved one or a different partner. This cure assumed, as Oscar Wilde once put it, that the quickest way to conquer yearning and temptation was to yield immediately and move on to more important matters. In China, excessive love between husband and wife was seen as a threat to the solidarity of the extended family. Parents could force a son to divorce his wife if her behavior or work habits didn't please them, whether or not he loved her. They could also require him to take a concubine if his wife did not produce a son. If his son's romantic attachment to his wife rivaled his parents' claims on the couple's time and labor, the parents would even send her back to her parents. In the Chinese language, the term love did not traditionally apply to feelings between husband and wife. It was used to describe an illicit, socially disapproved relationship. In the 1920s, a group of intellectuals invented a new word for love between spouses because they thought that such a radical new idea required its own special label.
What was that word?
Let's look it up. Going back to the notes.
You can't throw little factoids out like that and then not follow up on them. That's
Yeah,
the most
just
important part of this.
She just put like a 5 by it, but now there's not like a little.
This word was never written down for fear of its impact on the world.
Yeah, it honestly wasn't.
They called it love too, love harder. Well, I mean, I don't think it's like a new concept, and I think it's stupid of people in the 1920s to think that it was a new concept, because like we learned in our classical education that, the Greeks had numerous words for love. There was familial love, there was friendly love, there was romantic love,
Love for
sexual
God.
love. There were all these different ways you could adore and care about people. And I think that's something we've lost because we just throw around the word love without really like thinking about how it manifests in different ways for the people in our lives.
So I want to say that she has like 80 pages of notes. Like, I'm literally not even kidding you. Like 80 pages of notes, and then she has an index, and not one of those pages has what I'm looking for on it. So eventually we'll
water
figure.
everywhere, but not a drop to drink.
I know. So I'm going to continue. In Europe, during the 12th and 13th century, adultery became idolized as the highest form of love among the aristocracy. According to the Countess of Champagne, it was important for true love to exert its powers between two people who were married to each other.
I'm sorry, how much? We're skipping over how many thousands of years of human civilization? Or are we going to jump back?
Many. She goes in it's like wormholes through history, basically. So you're jumping into one century and then jumping back into another, essentially.
Wait, so why did people get married? Is it
I am getting there. Okay, I'm giving you history.
Okay, keep going.
In the 12th century France, Adrius Capellanus, Champlain, Chaplain, in Countess Marie
El Chapo.
wrote a treatise on the principles of courtly love. The first rule was that marriage is no excuse for not loving, but he meant loving for someone outside the marriage. As late as the 16th century, the French essayist Montaigne wrote that any man who is in love with his wife was the man so dull that no one could ever love him. Courtly love probably loomed larger in literature than in real life, but for centuries noblemen and kings fell in love with courtesans rather than their wives that they were married to for political reasons. Queens and noblewomen had to be more discreet than their husbands, but they looked beyond marriage for love and intimacy. So it talked a lot about, throughout this excerpt that I just read, a lot about people that like kings, queens, noble people. It didn't talk a lot about commoners. And this sharp distinction between love and marriage was common among the lower and middle class as well. So we don't see love and marriage until later on in history. So it goes and talks about illegitimacy also as a Western concept. It didn't, that rule in Japan where the firstborn son gets everything and then the secondborn son gets
I'm not
whatever.
With Japanese socio-political arrangements.
Okay, well, that's one thing. The second thing is illegitimacy was written up as part of a church concept, and she goes in later into detail about this, but I'll just glaze over it because it's honestly not important to the whole marriage topic that we're talking about, but I found it interesting, so I put it in here. It was a part of a church doctrine, and you had to, so for in the entirety of history, as long as you had a son, legitimate or not to your marriage, he could what do you call it? Success you. He could inherit everything that you had. And so he'd take your position as king or whatever you owned, basically. But suddenly the church, the Catholic Church specifically, was like, well, actually, we just want legitimate sons. So it changed this whole route of history. Before, you could have concubines, you could have mistresses, you could have anything under the sun. And as long as somebody had a son that you took as your own and not legitimized him, but took him and said, you are my son, and named him as your son, he could inherit everything that you had.
Wait, even if they came from someone who wasn't your
yes,
wife?
Up until the Catholic Church was like, we just want legitimate sons.
And that was people who had been married in the Catholic Church having
no
children.
It was literally anyone. So every culture had this sense of my son gets everything. Most cultures.
So what does legitimate mean if not the person you're married to?
Legitimacy. You're asking about legitimacy. Legitimacy is literally just whoever is through the Catholic Church married and has a son with you.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I misinterpreted your
okay, so
question.
A lot of this, my assumption, and this could be incorrect, is that medieval peasants and peasantry also got married. Is that true?
Yes.
And if so, did their rules of succession work the same way?
So, peasants, how in you can just imagine in the Middle Ages when you had the staple castle or the big piece of land that the person owned, and then you had a bunch of people working under you. So serfdom. So those people rarely lived together, and it was mainly the serfs would live in the houses of the people that they worked for. But later on, it moved into everyone having their own house. So everyone who had a family moved into their own house. But it almost always occurred as they didn't get married, but they cohabitated in order to be able to afford the house and split the housework.
I see. So... Okay, so I'm thinking about this, and so it seems so far in the history you've recounted,
yes,
marriage is utilized not ever for love, but for political convenience,
and I'll go into
economic gain, or simplifying household chores.
Yes,
and that seems weird to me because you have a family with a son,
mm-hmm.
and you have a family with a daughter,
mm-hmm.
and it seems like the family with the daughter wouldn't ever want to part with the daughter because the daughter does things around the house for them, and then gets married off to someone else and suddenly does things for them. So is that like where the concept of dowries came from? It's like we're giving up this person who weaves and cooks and does other stuff. You have to pay us in order for us to make that deal?
Yes. And I will go into more detail about it later, but the main reason for marriage between a son and a daughter was to confine assets. So the reason why there was a lot of incest...
Wait, I'm sorry. Where did son and daughter marriages come from? I don't think you mentioned
Okay, so you have a son of a king and a daughter of another king.
Okay.
And you converge the two families in order to confine assets. So you want to marry off your daughter for political reasons, and that's the only reason why. You're talking about commoners specifically. Yeah. The thing that I don't like about this book is that she goes into great detail about all these kings, queens, heiresses throughout history, but she has like a sentence or two after each long rant about these noble men and women about commoners. She doesn't go into great detail
there's
about
more
commoners.
Documentation relating to nobles than there probably is about commoners.
Yes, but the thing is that what I don't like about this book is that she goes into great detail about literally everyone else except for commoners.
Oh, okay, that's fun. So it's like marriage, a history for people wealthy enough to enjoy the privilege of marriage and all the benefits coming from it.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, let's rename the book right now.
Okay. While we're on the topic, I'm just asking random questions. Does she ever go back and talk about other cultures, or is it just marriage, a history in Western tradition?
No, she goes through China. And she talks about all of these different cultures all around the world. But the thing is that if I were to go through and talk about every single history throughout this book that she recounts, I would be sitting here and reading you the book.
But Naomi, podcast material. Okay, one
you
last
thing. You read the book.
Naomi, the entire time you kept talking about like feudal systems, I was thinking, surf's up, dude. And now I want there to be like a surfing comedy set in medieval England.
Called Serfdom? But spelled SURFDUMB.
King of the serfdom, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just like one peasant who has to out-surf like the king's son in a surfing competition off the British coastline.
Yeah.
In like the choppiest, grayest water you've ever seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they eat bangers and mash at the end to prove that they're friends.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, we've come up with a lot of good movie ideas on our podcast, and this one I think is a winner. We're going to do Predator with all the male archetypes.
I told you about my strip club idea, and you didn't like it, but I won't mention it because it was definitely an idea that I came up with Len, and now he wants to open up a strip club with that name.
Well, he's got the management skills.
He does.
Yeah, you've hitched yourself to the right horse.
I have. So then she starts to go into different reasons for marriage and partnerships. So she talks about the importance of in-laws, and you're thinking, what is the importance of in-laws? Like, in-laws are just in-laws, right? Well, she talks a lot about the fact that you want to get married to the right in-laws in order for proper legitimacy. So not just legitimacy of children, but you also want the legitimacy of your family. So you either want to marry up, or you want to be married to someone of equal status. You never want to be married to someone that has a lower status than you, because that can bring down your own status as an individual in society.
And to an extent, that's still true, right?
Yeah, for sure.
If someone who's college educated dates someone who's not, there's always people who are like, oh, well, I can see. Yeah,
Her short answer for this is it allows the property and status of the couple or the household head to be passed down to the next generation in an orderly manner.
Yeah, and
I don't like the phrase orderly manner.
But that's also a woefully insufficient explanation.
Yeah.
Like, I would argue a more concrete explanation, and again, I'm not the historian here, would be something along the lines of wealthy individuals didn't like the idea of elevating people that they didn't think were worthy of wealth and privilege to that level. And so they would shun people who did, for whatever reason, maybe make this mistake of marrying their maid or whatever. I'm not sure what sort of people they would be, rubbing elbows with at the time. I mean, it's very possible, too, that these individuals, these wealthy gentry, never really interacted with peasants in any meaningful way. And so there wasn't really an opportunity to form these relationships you might with people who you're constantly spending time with in the court, interacting with at great feasts and banquets and dances. And I don't know. I feel I'm talking too much like I've read a lot of medieval fantasy, not necessarily that I know anything about medieval history.
Well, the thing is, the reason why I bring up in-laws is for several reasons. The main reason is that she thinks that you have a sort of independence when you move out of the house that you grew up in, because throughout history you basically just went from living with your parents to living with your spouse, or you're all living under the same roof. So there's now a sense of independence when you move out of your parents' home and you move into a house or a place of living with your spouse. You're now married. So she says that this unprecedented independence of a married couple from their relatives and in-laws has allowed many husbands and wives to construct many more satisfying marriages than those of the past, but it also played a critical role in creating the crisis of modern marriage. I don't understand how you can have independence in a marriage and be happy, but also not create a crisis. Why does it create such a crisis in marriage? That's my question. Like, you are no longer affiliated with your in-laws. Many people aren't affiliated with their in-laws because they don't like each other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's something to be said about the decline of, like, close-knit families in Western societies. I saw something, it might have been a tweet online, which was like, one of the biggest lies capitalism told us was that you need to be fiercely independent and you can't rely upon your family. And so families kick out their kids at 18 and sort of leave them to fend for themselves, rather than being like, yeah, you can stay here, maybe, start contributing to rent or whatever, but like, we have all these resources, we have plates and furniture and other things you can use, rather than having to go out and buy your own sets, and, construct your own thing. And it's interesting that pretty much throughout human history, you've had these really close-knit families, like 6, 8, 10 people living in relatively close together. And I recognize a lot of that was for survival purposes, but you have this very strong bond that forms that kind of has gone away now that people live all by themselves. And, the only person they interact with often on a daily basis, if they are indeed dating or married to anyone, is their significant other.
Yeah.
Maybe their children, maybe their pet. But most of the time, I would argue that the people they're spending the most time with is the people they work with.
Yeah.
And we all know work sucks, so it's like your relationships are with the people who inspire the least joy in you, which I'm sure cannot be good for mental health.
I do think that that's what you're saying is true. I would like to mention that, like, in most like cultures around the world, there's this us in the United States, it's confusing for them because I knew a girl when I was in high school who'd moved from the Philippines to the United States when she was in like 4th or 5th grade. And so I asked her, I was like, hey, where are you going to college? And she's like, I'm going in state. And I was like, are you going to be moving out? And she was like, no. And that kind of confused me because here in the United States, we move out of our house and we go and we live our independent lives from our own parents, not our in-laws, just our own parents. And we just have we have this sense of independence. And in many other cultures, they stay at home until they get married. And so we've created this sense of independence that is not necessarily needed, but it's shunned. It's kind of looked down upon if you live with your parents for an extended period of time after you turn 18.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'd argue it stems from this sort of libertarian ethos that's in a lot of Western culture, where the government doesn't need to do anything for you. You need to be the one who takes responsibility for yourself.
Yeah.
You need to figure out how to best get health insurance. You need to figure out how to put food on your table. You need to figure out, if gas prices go up, how you're going to be able to get to work, right? And even though people pay taxes, even though they give back to society in so many ways, it seems that the structures that govern society don't think they need to do the same. And so there's this overall cultural idea you need to be fending for yourself that I think bleeds down to this idea you need to be moving out, no longer affiliated with your parents. Part of it, I think, also is a lot of media, which depicts parents as like cruel or abusive or uncool, and some people you don't want to hang around, these old fogies with these interests that don't mean anything to you, with all these boring rambling stories. And I have some friends who have incredible relationships with their parents and hang out with them on a consistent basis, even though they live by themselves and go over every weekend, and they bake them cookies and the parents give them I don't know, a new tire they sewed or whatever the heck parents do. But like I think there's this overall messaging to young people and older people, this is not a new phenomenon, that they are best served by being alone in the universe, fending for themselves. And I think, one, that's really damaging, and two, it's fundamentally untrue.
Yeah.
Because like the whole reason human civilization emerged in the first place was because we were able to form the bonds necessary to work together to complete large goals that people couldn't complete on their own. And when you lose that, society starts to crumble, which, I mean, not that it is. It's perfect right now. There are no issues. 100% good society.
No, I'm studying healthcare, if nobody knows, and I'm taking a class right now, and we're going through all the different like healthcare theories that you have in order to push health, not, what do you call those, PSAs? Health promotions,
public health policy.
Public health promotions. And so like we're going over like the smoking public promotions and things of that sort. But when you're going through these theories, it one of them specifically, and I don't remember the specific name, I probably should, I'm probably gonna post it on it, but it just basically talks about the fact that there's such an importance of people living and functioning in groups. It's not normal for people to be independent and not be like completely independent and not be in some way working together to have some sense of a group or connection with other people.
Some of the longest living people are in areas that have close-knit neighborhoods and communities. I think it's the oldest peoples in the world, like on average, are in, I think, Sardinia or maybe Greece.
So where sardines are from?
Yes, it's sparkling fish if they're not from the Sardinia region of Italy. But yeah, like exactly what you're talking about, this idea that people work best when they have a community around them. And it's not just because, like, I think mentally you feel better supported by people. It's minor stuff like, hey, Bill, you look a little down today. Maybe you should, go to the doctor or something. With people looking out for your best interests and able to, see and notice things you yourself don't notice. There are a lot of, long-term effects of working and living with other people. I know, my coworkers have a pretty good idea of when I'm like sick because I've, been working in the same place for 3 years. And so when I'm less chipper or less talkative than normal, they can pretty much assume I have a sore throat or a sneeze or a cough or something. And I find that just absolutely fascinating. I can't imagine what it would be like if you're living with someone for 10, 15 years, 20 years at a time.
Yeah, I always thought it was so interesting, like, our mother specifically like knows tics about all of us that we don't even recognize in ourselves. So like I'll act in a certain way and she'll be like, what's wrong? And I'll be like, what? Nothing's wrong. And she'll be like, no, what's going on? Are you stressed? Like something like, it's small
Naomi
things.
dyes one streak in her hair.
No. Like when I get really stressed, I get overly affectionate. So I like hug people a lot, or I like, you never accept my hugs, okay? So, like, I'll hug her, like, a couple extra times in a visit or something, and she'll be like, what's wrong? Why are you so stressed? And I'm like, I'm not stressed. But, like, my body is, like, tense, and I'm just like, oh, maybe I was stressed. You know what I mean? So, like, I think that's interesting that, like, it's something that she notices because she's known us, obviously, since we were in the womb. So, anyways. Something that I did want to mention, since we are a brother-sister podcast, is these things called brother-sister marriages. And you're going to think, that's kind of strange. And I'm going to explain it to you because it's not actually a marriage. In name, it is a partnership. It's
a limited liability company written for tax purposes, such as a podcast.
0% APR. It's these it's a small culture in China called the Na society, and it was it's basically just sister brother marriages, and you're gonna think that's kind of strange, and I'm gonna explain it. So it's these men and women living together. They're related by blood. They're siblings, and they live together and they cohabitate and they run a household. So they cook for each other, they clean for each other. They might find sexual partners for the other person. I'm just kidding, I don't know specifically, it didn't mention that part. But when one sibling does have a child, it is raised by their other siblings. So if I had a child, you would help raise my child with me. My significant other, or the person who got me pregnant, would not be helping raise the child because he would be raising his sister's children.
Of course, and I have very reasonable hourly rates, Naomi.
And these types of relationships are more long-lasting and meaningful than they found than love relationships. Because when you're get married based off of love, there's some things that can break. People change. Obviously, we talk about this a lot on our podcast. The fact that there's a lot of divorce in this country is because, one, it's become more normalized, and two, people are realizing that people change over time, and that's okay. And you don't have to love that same person that you got married to. And it's okay to say, hey, look, you have changed so much that I just can't deal with this anymore. For instance, if your significant other before you got married or got into a relationship with them was not a liar, and suddenly they are a liar after 10 years of marriage, I wouldn't want to be in a relationship with a liar. When you're in a brother-sister relationship, yes, there are those qualities, but it's not based off of romantic love. There's a trust element there, but it's not the same kind of trust that you have for a loved one. Does that make sense?
I don't know if it's necessarily that people change over time. I think
that's just an example of why marriage is hard.
I think a lot of people discover things they don't like about their significant others, not necessarily that they've changed, but because they were hiding something, whether it be I have $300,000 of student loan debt.
Oh my God.
I have a horrible gambling addiction. I, keep hiring prostitutes. And look, I know this is going to get clipped and used against me, I'm sure.
Yeah.
At my Supreme Court confirmation hearings at some point in the future. And it's no longer that you need to, stay with that partner once you've discovered these things that might be deal breakers for some individuals if, their significant other was lying to them about it for this long. And so I think the benefit of a brother-sister relationship, as you're talking about, is I would assume if your siblings with someone, you have a better feel for what's going on in their lives, and it's harder for them to, maintain secrets long-term. That may be untrue, but if you've been living together for, all your life in this kind of communal relationship, I think it's going to be very difficult for vices and virtues to not be discovered and understood by the other person. So it's a lot less surprises, a lot less baggage to take with you when you're working together to raise kids.
There's a lot less at stake.
Yeah. And I don't know what the idea is behind raising the kids, but I think a lot of people who are parents want to instill their values upon those children.
Yes.
And if you get married to someone, oh my God, they might have different values, but if you keep it in the family, so to speak. No, I mean, seriously, if you're raising people constantly within a familial environment, and you are interested in keeping, your family traditions alive, it seems significantly easier if you and your family are the ones doing it, not you and another person you might have disagreements with. Now, I think there's definitely downsides to that, don't get me wrong, but I can understand kind of the logic and maybe the origins of it.
So I want to move right along and talk about like not early civilization, but just early humans, and then talk from there how that has turned into what we think of marriage today. And I think that will, let me just read this.
Really giving us a good wind up now.
I don't have a lot more to say.
Naomi was really good at writing essays, but never the intros. She'd just get into it and be like, here are 3 points. And the teacher would be like, well, why are we reading this essay?
That's actually so true.
Oh, okay.
Today, most paleontologists reject the notion that that early human societies were organized around dominant male hunters providing for their nuclear families. For one thing, in the early phases of hominid and human evolution, did I say that right?
Hominid.
Hominid? Okay.
But everything's pronounced homo and
Yeah.
archaeology, so I can understand the confusion.
Hominid. It sounds like
Homonym.
yeah, there we go. And hominid and human evolution, hunting big games was less important for group survival than were gathering plants, bird eggs, edible insects, and shellfish, trapping the occasional small animal, and scavenging the meat of large animals that had died of natural causes. When early humans began to hunt large animals, they did so by driving animals over cliffs or into swamps. These activities involved the whole group, women as well as men. This was what happens in the surrounds conducted by the modern day foragers, where the entire band encircles the game and gradually herds it into a trap. We cannot know for sure how the earliest hominids and humans organize their reproduction and family lives, but there are 3 general schools of thought on the subject. Some researchers believe that early humans lived in a family-centered groups made up of mother sisters and their young, accompanied by temporary male companions. Younger males, they suggest, left the group when they reached mating age. Other scholars argue that the needs of defense would have encouraged the formation of groups based on male kin, in which fathers, brothers, and sons, along with their female mates, stayed together. In this view, a female offspring rather than males left the group at puberty. A third group of researchers theorized that hominid groups were organized around one male mating with several females and traveling with them and their offspring. So that's interesting, because I was always taught that like early hunters were just like a big group of people, and it was based around men hunting, and there wasn't necessarily and there wasn't a need for women. It was just like, oh, we have you here to raise children.
I've heard conflicting things. Like you mentioned this, that the outdated view of women picking berries and weaving and men hunting, mammoths or whatever is outdated. And I've heard, a big part of that is the fact that if you're foraging, it's a far more energy efficient way of getting food. Like you can get significantly more calories per hour looking for berries and grubs and, clams or whatever in the ocean than you can running after a mammoth.
Yeah.
And you're not guaranteed to get that large game. The large game is bigger than you and faster than you. And it's hard unless you're doing what you're talking about, which is working together in large groups to sort of direct where they go and, get them into a corner or drive them off a cliff. I hadn't heard a lot about those early arrangements. I was reading David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where he talks about early trading, and he debunks a lot of myths about like how trading systems got set up. One of the things he mentions is that there's been anthropological observation of tribal groups in like the Amazon doing trading ceremonies where they meet up with other bands of hunter-gatherers and they make like a big bonfire celebration, and they these elaborate rituals where the men of the other group will come over and pursue the women of the first group and like do like sexually suggestive dancing and then pull them off into the bushes and they'll, have sex or whatever. And then the men of the first group will do the same to the women of the others. And so you have this like trust that's built immediately by like having sex with the other people's, I don't know if you'd call them wives or just like acquaintances.
I'm imagining like early Magic Mike dances.
Not much to pull off if you're just wearing a loincloth, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's a long wind up to get to that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have sex with the other groups, like maybe, let's say, wife for purpose of simplification. And after that trust has been established, where it's like, oh, this person didn't murder me or whatever, we had like consensual sex, that's when the trading begins. And the trading rituals then are even kind of weird because it's like you point at something and like aggressively go after it and try to rip it off people or whatever. It varies depending on the area. But yeah, the idea was you would have sex with other groups. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is that seems like an easy way of adding genetic diversity, where you have one clan of people who are like maybe related to each other going around, and another clan of people maybe genetically related to each other going around. And one way of solving all the problems of like incest is going and having sex with other people not related to you.
Yeah.
And then there's the big benefit of you no longer have to deal with this group of people who may have different opinions and prejudices and beliefs that you do, and get to do your thing, raising your kid in the way you want, and they get to do exactly the same thing. So in that case, I'd say women would be very valuable. And I think often women are underestimated as valuable in early civilization. Though I guess to some extent, I'm not sure if early civilization thought about the long-term health or the short-term health of their groups. I don't know.
Well, let's talk about why marriage was invented.
Oh my God, the whole point of this book.
So I just went over how women played a part in early society in
and
ways.
I just mansplained anthropology.
Ooh. So the story that marriage was invented for the protection of women is still a very widespread myth about the origins of marriage. According to the protective or provider theory of marriage, women and infants in early human societies could not survive without men to bring them the meat of the woolly mammoths and protect them from marauding saber-toothed tigers and from other men seeking to abduct them.
This is like a Flintstones view of society.
Yeah. I didn't even know that there was early abductions.
Okay.
I just thought that everyone just, like, when they saw other, like, nomads, they just be like, hey, okay, bye. That's how I thought it went.
I'm picturing that. You remember the scene in the movie Shaun of the Dead?
Never saw it. You saw it without me.
Oh, okay. They're trying to survive a minor zombie apocalypse in Britain, and at one point in the film, they encounter another group that looks nearly identical to them.
Yeah.
And they just walk past going, hey, 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 hey. And they have this, like, weird kind of deja vu moment. And it's not remarked upon at all in the movie, but I assume every nomad group, has the, big Chad guy who's actually a himbo, and, the tomboy girl who wants to, prove herself and fight in a man's world.
You know the white person nod that I showed you the other week? That's like, the face that you always make in selfies?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how I imagine nomads, to just walk by each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad that even in our depictions of early human civilization, these people are always white. I mean, obviously they were.
Yeah, yeah.
There are lots of white monkeys.
So let me get back into it. But males were willing to protect and provide only if their own females and offspring had good reason to believe were theirs. So women needed to find and hold on to a strong, aggressive mate. One way a man could hold a mate was to offer him exclusive and frequent sex in return for food and protection. According to the theory, this is why women lost the estrous cycle that is common to other mammals, in which females come into heat only at periodic intervals. Human females became whoa.
This is like an incel describing. Human females won't date me.
I actually have to say something about incels after I read this quote. Human females became sexually available year-round so that they were able to draw men into long-term relationships. In anthropologist Robin Fox's telling of this story, the females could easily trade on the male's tendencies to want to monopolize, or at least think he was monopolizing the females for mating purposes, and say, in effect, okay, you get the monopoly and we get the meat. The male willingness to trade meat for sex, with the female throwing in whatever nuts and berries they'd gather to sweeten the deal, was, according to Fox, the root of truly human society.
Wait, is she promoting this view or saying it's outdated?
Proponents of this protective theory of marriage claim that the nuclear family, based on a sexual division of labor between the hunter and the male hunter and the female hearth keeper, was the most important unit of survival and protection in the Stone Age.
Is that the outdated view or the accepted one?
So, people in the 20th century found this story persuasive because it closely resembled the male breadwinner and female homemaker family to which they were accustomed.
Yeah, because it seems in that example, they're like, well, we needed this, so evolution made it happen. And that's not really how evolution works. If anything, I'd say it's an evolutionary adaptation for humans to be able to reproduce at all times compared to like other species, because humans take so long to develop and nurture. You don't want, maybe even that's a poor phrasing. It's an evolutionary benefit to be able to have children at all time if children take so long to raise before they're independent. Right? If you can only have children like 3 months a year,
yeah,
and the children take 5-10 years, we'll say, until they can fend for themselves, but they die at some point during that 10-year period because it's a tough world out there, then your species isn't going to survive very long. And so the only way humans, could survive is if somehow they had evolutionarily adapted, and if they hadn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
So going back to the incels, I just read an article put out by a group, I think it was the FBI, I'm not entirely sure, talking about how incels are now the number one terrorist threat in the United States.
Is that based on prior terrorist threats?
I need to come up with the article and we can talk
Okay.
about it at a later point, but I just found that out today and I was like, great, being a woman in society sucks.
Does this mean the FBI is going to start doing stings on white males who drink Mountain Dew and eat Doritos?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I'm just talking because, when Middle Eastern people were considered the greatest threat to the United States after the early 2000s, the FBI kept, coming up to them and being like, hey, you want to build bombs? You want to hang out and build bombs? And so I assume now they're going to be like, you want to murder women? And they're going to start giving them the resources to do that.
Well, this was based off of a series of attacks on women. Specifically, there was one in like 2008, I think there was, in a yoga class where this guy was propositioning this woman and she said no, so he just killed her. Yeah. And there's been a series of those events since then.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the drop of just the evolution of marriage and how it's started from condensing assets to now moving into love, and how that brought about purity culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and this episode. And then next week, we'll be talking about the formation of Western marriage. So we're just really seeping into...
I mean, the commercial comes after the show.
Oh, shit. Sorry.
Law and a marriage.
So let's just talk about the evolution of marriage for connection based to be about consolidating wealth and how that moved into purity culture. So I actually read a book a number of years ago called The Purity Myth, and great book, totally recommend it. It was talking about the purity culture in this country that was associated with a woman's virginity. So I'm going to give the long story short. Basically, there's a huge amount of purity culture still going on to this day, and it's based off of these coming of age parties that happen. It can be through your church, it can be through different organizations, but it's not just among the wealthy these days. So there's this party that men bring their daughters to where there's a lock and key ceremony and the daughter pledges her virginity to the dad, and the dad has to give the key to his son-in-law on the wedding day. And it's a really gross process, and it's literally just showing that women are still pieces of property in this society, and it's disgusting. So
literally the second episode of the podcast, The Dollop, was on purity balls, which they dig into this topic and have some great anecdotes. It's 7 years old, but this is still going on.
So if you want to listen to that instead of reading the book that I just suggested.
Yeah, fair point.
So we talked not a lot, but we noted on the fact that there's been an evolution of marriage since the beginning of time. So you had your early marriages where you just got together and mated. And then you had your marriages where you were put together either for political purposes or for the purposes of keeping your wealth. And that was all of these were for the purpose of keeping your main family the way it was. So your mother and father had the same amount of wealth or even more wealth walking out of that marriage. So we now move into not yet where we see love as a part of marriage, but now we're moving into how it became about consolidating wealth.
I'm confused. Pause for a second.
Go ahead.
You gave an example of what one of the myths was about how marriage first originated, and then said that was an outdated view, popular because of perceptions of women and men and husbands and wives in the 20th century. So do we have any theories mentioned in the book about what really happened? Or is the author just like, yeah, that just seemed convenient, so that's what they came up with?
She gives a long evolution of how it got to the way it is today, and I'm about to add to the notes that we have about this evolution at this point in the episode. So we are moving away from marriage as a sort of status holder and moving into marriage and how it became incestuous throughout history because of people wanting to keep all their wealth in one place. And then in next week's episode, we're going to talk about how it became rooted around love.
Well, I'm still confused where marriage came from in the first place. Like, it was utilized as a means of preserving wealth and, like, royalty culture, but why did royals think they needed to do this in the first place?
It was a mixture of religion, and she doesn't give exact reasons why, but it's a mixture between religion and the fact that people cohabitating was considered not okay when religion came about. So you needed to have somebody, and there's various reasons why, but once you had a child with someone, you needed to stay with them.
And this is true of all religions, not just Western?
No, I'm talking about Western. She did not go into very much detail about other.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
that was your main question? Okay.
So sorry. So back to, what was it, incest?
So we're talking about how marriage became incestuous.
Oh.
So as marriage became the primary vehicle for transmitting status and property, both men and women faced greater restrictions on their behavior. Men, like women, could be forced to marry women chosen by their parents, but because women could bear a child with an impure bloodline, introducing a foreign interest into a family, their sexual behavior tended to be more strictly supervised, and females were subject to severe penalties for adultery and premarital sex. The laws and moral codes of ancient states exhorted men to watch carefully over their wives, lest the seed of others be sown on your soil. Distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate children became sharper in all the early stage, and children born into unauthorized liaisons could not inherit land titles and citizenships rights, and so in many cases were effectively condemned to slavery or starvation. So
this
that's
is why Naomi won't be getting anything from our parents.
That's very true. I'm actually adopted. So this is the start of purity culture at its finest. So it's not just it's not just women. It's also shunned upon with men, but it is mainly just about women because they can potentially carry an impure bloodline, a person of impure bloodline in their womb. And this is the start of illegitimate children.
It's interesting what impurity, because like you were talking about how it was formerly a way of like preserving your social status, and it would seem that if you had sex and then the child of like a duke or someone in a court, you would still preserve your social status. If anything, you could elevate it by having an illegitimate child.
But religion.
Yeah. If I can, I don't fully recall this, but I did read Foucault's History of Sexuality. Oh, we should do that book at some point. That one's a hoot and a half. Foucault wrote kind of a philosophical treatise on his beliefs about like how sex shaming and the sin perception of having sex came from. And one of the things he talks about is the role of the confession booth in the Middle Ages, and says that the confession booth was something utilized to discuss sin, and over time, as the priest became a more powerful figure in a local community and became, a source of wisdom and judgment, they realized that they could utilize the confession booth to take greater control over people's lives by making more elements of their life sinful.
Yeah.
And so before, a priest had listened to, people in a booth be like, oh yeah, I made out with, I don't know, my neighbor. I forgot to, thank my parents, and wish them good health. And there was a lot of like weird sex stuff people would talk about, and they're like, is this, a sin of Sodom or whatever?
Yeah.
Am I doing bad stuff by, doing this? And over time, the priests were just like, oh yeah, all that weird sex stuff is weird and you shouldn't like it, and you're strange for appreciating, whatever that person does to you. And so more and more sexual behavior began to be restricted and seen as verboten, because, again, priest culture was recognizing this was a way of exerting influence. Now, in fairness, Foucault does not like the church, so this argument could be heavily rooted in the idea that he doesn't like the church and wants to portray them as being bad and evil. But I think there's something to this idea that if the church plays a crucial role in your life, you're going to look to that for guidance. And if the church is saying certain things are bad, you're going to see them as sinful and shameful and move away from it. So whether that's having sex with people who are other than your husband, whether that's having sex with the same sex, whether that's doing things that aren't penis, vagina, sex for purpose of procreation, those are all things that were, he argues, condemned at roughly the same time because of the greater control the church was exerting on people's lives. We're doing that now. Well, okay, we're going to do that. That's fun.
The last thing I want to mention before we wrap up this episode is the problems with polygamy that they had throughout history. So she goes into a lot of detail about different cultures that had polygamy as a part of their marriage. And the fact was that when polygamy was a part of marriage, especially among noblemen and women, it led to a lot of deaths. And you're thinking, why? Well, because of the fact that there are lots of heirs to noblemen's status, wives would get involved after their husband died, and they would take out the other wives and the other heirs by poisoning or just straight up killing them or challenge them to a battle or things of that sort. So it was kind of moved away from and moved into more like legitimate children because of that reason. Because you were getting rid of the pure blood and having a half blood. Half blood? Is that a thing?
I mean, I don't want to get into blood politics on this podcast. That's always a dangerous territory. If we're talking about purity in the concept, in the concept of marriage.
Yeah,
I would imagine pure means it is from the husband and wife who have formed a sacred covenant for the purposes of extending their bloodlines or whatever. And then a half person, I don't know, bastard, I guess is the technical term, would be someone who only one of the parents had contributed their genetic material to.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Good stuff. Okay, well, I hope everyone has a good week.
We're just going to wrap it up like that?
Yeah, I don't know what else to say there. I don't feel like there's anything else we need to say. Half-bloods versus full-bloods.
Oh, God.
It's such a chaotic episode, I know.
Is there anything we could end on that's a more positive, cheery note?
This cherry juice kind of just tasted like liquid cherry pie. So if you're into that, go get it. Would you?
Ooh, like I mentioned floats last week.
Yeah.
I think this would be good with vanilla ice cream.
You think everything would be good with vanilla ice cream?
Vanilla ice cream's a good. It's like the tofu of ice cream. It carries
Ew.
flavor. Yeah, it's excellent. Naomi, we are rapidly approaching episode 52, but episode 52 is not our year anniversary because we've done a number of episodes in between episodes.
Yeah.
So we are approaching our year anniversary in May. We are excited. We got some fun stuff coming. We're going to talk about the podcast. We might have some special guests making appearances. We're going to be doing giveaways of new cars to all of our listeners.
You get a car.
Like
You get a car.
We're going to be launching our dating app, which we've been working on tirelessly for the better part of our lives. We're going to be
Can you stop lying to the audience and actually give them some facts?
To prevent Kanye West from getting close to his ex-wife at any point in the future. Yeah. Oh my God, we're going to uncover the assassination plot against Pete Davidson and save his life. That's going to be our contribution to culture.
Okay.
Saving Pete.
I'm honestly just surprised you know who that is.
I'm honestly surprised that we haven't broken up yet as a podcast duo.
Oh, it's kind of sad.
Which I'm saying speaks to the strength of our relationship.
Actually, I would like to say that episode 52 will be my last episode. I'm just kidding. Okay, everyone, have a great week. We'll see you back next week.
We have many thanks for the use of our theme music, which is the song Drop by Ketsa. You can find more of their music online at ketsa.uk. You can also find Date These Guys online on Twitter and Instagram at DateTheseGuys or visit datetheseguys.org. If you have questions for the podcast or want to be a wealthy sugar parent, send an email to datetheseguys@gmail.com. If you're looking to make an impact in the world, this show strongly recommends Planned Parenthood, a nonprofit organization that provides reproductive health care in the United States. Planned Parenthood provides birth control, long-acting reversible contraceptive implants, clinical breast examinations, pregnancy screenings, prenatal care, testing and treatment for sexually transmitted infections, and abortions. They also do great work for those who are lower income. 4/5 of their clients are at or below 50% of the federal poverty line. Both Joel and Naomi are monthly donors to Planned Parenthood. We hope you will be too.